The NHLA grading rules for hardwood lumber were designed by practical lumbermen for the purpose of furthering regional trade in hardwood lumber. The rules are applied by both sellers at the shipping end of a transaction and buyers at the receiving end. Uniform rules allow buyers in California, for instance, to purchase a load of white oak from Missouri and have a reasonable expectation of receiving the quality of lumber that is merchantable to their customers. The real importance of grades in commerce is that the price of lumber is established in large measure with respect to grade. Other factors enter into the equation, such as species, availability, degree of dryness, distance from the customer, special sizes, etc. But for the most part, the higher the grade, the higher the price. With some exceptions, hardwood lumber is graded on the basis of the size and number of cuttings or pieces, which can be obtained from a board when it is cut up and used in the manufacture of a hardwood product, such as furniture, flooring, or interior house trim. Common usage dictates that the cuttings usually be clear wood, so that undesirable defects such as splits, rot, bark pockets, and other such defects do not appear in the finished product. Generally speaking, the higher the grade, the larger area of clear material contained in an individual board. When cut up for furniture parts, the upper grades will yield a larger proportion of the board and a few large-sized clear cuttings. Lower grades will yield a smaller proportion of the board and a greater number of small-sized cuttings. The grading system established by the National Hardwood Lumber Association for hardwood lumber is referred to as the cutting unit method. Two important terms you must understand to fully grasp how the cutting unit system works are clear face cutting and clear face cutting units. A clear face cutting is a measurement of clear, defect-free wood on the board. All the grades have a minimum percentage of clear wood required, and an inspector will break the board down into these clear areas to determine grade. The size of a clear cutting is measured in cutting units. A cutting unit is 1 inch wide by 1 foot long. To determine the amount of units in a clear face cutting, the inspector multiplies the width of the cutting in inches by the length of the cutting in feet. Under the cutting unit method, the total amount of clear cutting units measured determines the grade of the board. The standard grades are simply categories which specify the range of clear material measured in cutting units that a board must contain to fall into a particular grade. Before I begin discussing the individual grades, a few more key points need to be mentioned. Hardwood lumber is measured in board feet, abbreviated BF. A board foot is 12 inches wide by 12 inches long by 1 inch thick, or its equivalent. However, when an inspector measures lumber, he can speed up the calculations by assuming that the lumber is all 1 inch thick. The grade is based on the surface area or surface measure of the board, abbreviated SM. The surface measure is calculated by multiplying the full width of the board by the standard length and dividing this sum by 12, rounding to the nearest whole number. For example, a board that is 9 inches wide by 8 foot long would have a 6 foot surface measure. The surface measure is equal to board foot measure in 1 inch thick lumber. If the lumber you are grading is thicker than 1 inch, the surface measure remains the same, but to calculate board feet, you multiply the surface measure times the thickness in inches. For example, our board that is 9 inches wide by 8 foot long has a 6 foot surface measure. If our board were 2 inches thick, we would multiply our surface measure of 6 times our thickness of 2 inches, which would give us 12 board feet. Remember, the grade is based on the surface measure of the board, not the board foot measure. Since hardwood lumber is usually sawn in random width and length, calculating surface measure can be time-consuming. To speed up the process, lumber inspectors have a tool available to them that automatically calculates the surface measure of the board. This is referred to as a lumber rule. With it, the inspector can quickly determine the surface measure by placing the rule across the width of the board and reading down the corresponding length. For example, on this 10-foot board, I put my ruler across the width of the board, I read down the 10-foot scale, which would give me an 8-foot surface measure. Finally, hardwood boards have 2 sides or faces. Unless otherwise specified, hardwood lumber grades are established from the poor face of the board. The inspector examines both sides of the board and decides which face yields the least amount of clear face cutting units or the side with the lower grade. This poor face is where the grade is established. The theory here is that a board is only as good as its worst face. Now let's begin our discussion of the standard grades and their requirements. FAS is the top grade, also referred to as first and seconds. The requirements for FAS are a minimum size board of 6 inches wide and 8 foot long, a minimum clear cutting size of 3 inches wide by 7 foot long, or 4 inches wide by 5 foot long. This means that the clear area between defects and the end or the edge of the board must be at least this minimum size. The limits assure the purchaser of FAS lumber long, clear pieces of defect-free wood. The minimum clear cutting area to make the grade of FAS is 10/12 or 83 1/3%. In cutting units, this is calculated by multiplying the surface measure times 10. The grade of FAS also limits the number of cuttings you can use. The number of cuttings allowed is determined by dividing the surface measure by 4 and dropping any fractions. Now let's grade 2 sample boards while applying these requirements. First of all, we'll measure the length for surface measure. 6. We have an 8-foot board. The width is a little over 9 inches wide, so that'll give us a 6-foot surface measure. Multiplying surface measure by 10, we now know that it requires 60 clear-face cutting units for this board to grade FAS. Then, by dividing the surface measure by 4, you get 1.5, and as I mentioned before, in determining the amount of cuttings allowed, we drop all fractions, and in this case, we would be allowed 1 cutting. Summing this up, this tells us that we need 60 clear-face cutting units in 1 cutting. The cutting that is available to us on this board, again, remember we're measuring clear wood, is 9 inches wide by a total of 6 3/4 feet. Again, measuring clear wood, stopping at our defect. 9 inches wide by 6 3/4 feet in length gives us a total of 60 3/4 cutting units, enough to grade FAS. Our second example has an 8-inch width and an 8-foot length, which would give us a 5-foot surface measure. For FAS, we would need 50 cutting units, or surface measure times 10, in 1 cutting, or surface measure divided by 4, again dropping fractions. Our clear face cutting available to us is 8 inches in width, starting at the other side of this little knot, and measuring 6 feet, 6 inches in length. 8 inches wide, 6.5 feet in length, gives us 52 cutting units, again, enough to grade FAS. FAS will allow 1 additional cutting if the surface measure is between 6 and 15 foot. But the yield goes up to surface measure times 11, which is 11/12 or 91 2/3% clear face cuttings. The next grade in order of importance is the grade of selects. Selects is a combination of FAS and number 1 common, so I will discuss the number 1 common grading requirements, and then we'll come back to selects. Number 1 common is frequently referred to as the cabinet grade due to its required clear yield and minimum cutting sizes. The minimum size board for number 1 common is 3 inches wide by 4 foot long. The minimum clear cutting size is 3 inches wide by 3 foot long, or 4 inches wide by 2 foot long, which fits perfectly into the cabinet industry's sizes for their finished products. The minimum clear area for number 1 common is 8/12 or 66 2/3%. In clear face cutting units, this is calculated by surface measure times 8. To determine the number of cuttings permitted, add 1 to the surface measure and divide by 3, dropping all fractions. Now let's look at our sample board. It measures 9 inches in width by 8 foot in length, which gives us a 6-foot surface measure. For the number 1 common grade, we multiply our surface measure times 8 for the number of cutting units. In this case, we would need 48. To determine the number of cuttings allowed for number 1 common, we take our surface measure plus 1 divided by 3 In this case, 6 plus 1 is 7, divided by 3 allows us 2 cuttings after we drop the fractions. The first cutting we measure on the board is 3 5-foot long by 8 inches in width, which gives us 40 cutting units. Our next cutting is 2.5 feet long by 4 inches wide, which gives us a total of 10 cutting units. The total amount in the 2 clear face cuttings is 50 cutting units. For the number 1 common grade, we needed 48, so this board would in fact grade number 1 common. Number 1 common will allow 1 additional cutting if the surface measure is between 3 and 10 foot, but the required clear cutting units increases to surface measure times 9. Now let's discuss the selects grade. Remember, the grade is normally established by the poor side of the board. For example, if the poor face grades FAS and the good face grades FAS, the grade of the board is an FAS. If the poor face grades number 1 common and the good face grades number 1 common, then it's a 1 common board. However, if the poor face of the board grades number 1 common and the good face of the board grades FAS, this is referred to as a select. The select grade is a combination of FAS requirements on the better side of the board and number 1 common requirements on the poor face. The minimum size board for select is 4 inches wide by 6 foot long. All the grading requirements that apply to FAS apply to this better face. All the grading requirements for number 1 common apply to this poor side. A similar grade to selects is FAS 1 face. The primary difference is the minimum board size. The FAS 1 face grade must be 6 inches wide by 8 foot long, the same requirements as FAS, while the selects will allow the smaller 4x6 board. Both grades are virtually interchangeable except for board size requirements. Now let's discuss the number 2 common grade. The grade of number 2 common is the economy grade, used for flooring, frame stock, and small clear parts. Number 2 common requires a minimum board size of 3 inches by 4 feet. The clear cutting size for number 2 common is 3 inches wide by 2 foot long. Our clear cutting units needed is surface measure times 6, which is 6/12 or 50% clear. The number of cuttings required is calculated by dividing the surface measure by 2, again dropping fractions. Now let's look at our sample board. The board measures 9 inches wide by 8 foot in length, which gives us a 6 foot surface measure. For the number 2 common grade, we multiply our surface measure times 6 for number of cutting units. In this case, we would need 36 clear face cutting units. To determine the number of cuttings allowed, we divide our surface measure by 2. For this particular board, we would be allowed 3 cuttings. Remember, our cuttings have to be clear. So the 2 obvious ones I see are a crosscut here, possibly another crosscut here, and maybe a little rip across the top. The first cutting measures 2 1/3 feet long by 9 inches wide, which gives us 21 cutting units. Our second cutting, again measuring between our defects, is 2 feet long by 9 inches wide, which gives us 18 cutting units. Well, the total in these 2 clear face cuttings is 39. We said for this 2 common board, we would need 36 cutting units. We could take another cutting up top here, but again, we've already established our minimum clear yield. So the grade of this board is number 2 common. At this time, we need to summarize what we have discussed today and place the practice of hardwood lumber grading in perspective. The important steps in the process of grading hardwood lumber can be summarized as follows. Determine the species. Determine the surface measure using a board rule. Determine the pour side of the board. Assign a trowel grade to the pour face based on your estimate of the yield of clear wood. Determine number of cuttings permitted in the trowel grade, keeping in mind the minimum size of cuttings required for that particular grade. Determine the clear face cutting units needed. We do this by multiplying the surface measure times the multiplier for that particular grade. Calculate the total area of clear face cutting units on the pore face. If the pore face does not yield sufficient clear face cutting units of the right size and number of cuttings, try the next lower grade. Remember, the reverse side of the clear face cutting must be sound. Tally surface measure by grade and thickness. Although our hardwood forests are a renewable natural resource, their utilization is important. The high-quality logs are becoming more difficult to find, which emphasizes the need to separate lumber for its most efficient use. The grades are a tool which provide producers and consumers with a way to evaluate boards for quality and efficient utilization. The grading and measurement of hardwood lumber is not a simple matter and should not be undertaken lightly. Now that you have had a brief exposure to the cutting unit method and some of the specifics of the standard grades, you need to consider setting aside time for more in-depth study than can be covered by this video presentation. The National Hardwood Lumber Association offers a 14-week-long inspection training school held 3 times a year at NHLA headquarters in Memphis, Tennessee. This course is designed to train new lumber inspectors for the industry. 1-week-long short courses are presented 25 times a year in different parts of the country in cooperation with a co-sponsor such as the Missouri Department of Conservation. These short courses are intended to familiarize the student with the official rules and with characteristics of lumber and are usually attended by office and sales personnel or sawmill and lumberyard employees. For more information on either of these courses and for grading publications including the official NHLA rulebook, contact the National Hardwood Lumber Association, P.O. Box 34518, Memphis, Tennessee 38184, 0518. Our telephone number is 901-377-1818, or you can fax us at 901-382-6419.